Good evening. I would like to welcome everyone, and I would like to say that the Chassam Sofer was once confronted by a man who had been very rich. He was the Gevir of the Shtot, of the city, and he lost all of his money. So he came to the Chassam Sofer and he wanted a bracha from him to get back his wealth, that something should happen, come his way. And I heard this story, I think from a Rabbi friend, or maybe, I'm not sure, but I heard it from someone. And the Chassam Sofer told him, your eitzah to get back your wealth is to find a poor person and give him money. So the person thought that the Chassam Sofer did not hear him. So he said, Rebbe, I am the one who needs the bracha. I lost my money. So the Chassam Sofer said to him, I heard you, and I'm telling you that that is the way to gain your wealth back again. And we learn it from Parshas Va'era, which is the reading of this week, the Seder this week, that the pasuk says, "V'gam ani shamati es na'akas b'nei Yisrael asher Mitzrayim ma'avidim osam." So he said to him that there is a question, a world-famous question that is asked. What does it mean? The pasuk "V'gam ani shamati." That means HaKadosh Baruch Hu heard the crying. But what do you mean? HaKadosh Baruch Hu said "V'gam ani shamati," and also I heard. Who's the also? Who else could have heard? So the Meforshim explain that it's referring to Yid to Yid. That means the Medrash says that there were some Yidden, even in the height of the poverty, who had their own slaves. That means there's always very poor in every situation. There's some more well-to-do. And the Medrash says that there were some Yidden who went to the Mitzrayim and said, I want another Jew to work for me, to make it easier for me. And indeed, it was made easier for the person because he had avodim. He had avodim. And they were able, that means HaKadosh Baruch Hu heard the sighing and the moaning and the groaning of all of the Yidden, but another Yid who had empathy for the fellow standing next to him and couldn't bear the load that he was carrying, heard the sighing and the sifting of the other Jew. And that's what the pasuk means, V'gam ani shamati, that I also, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I heard, in addition to the Jews who were pained and grieved at what their own brethren next to them were suffering through. So said the Chassam Sofer, that is the basis for what I am telling you, because it was at that moment when HaKadosh Baruch Hu heard that Yidden were pained by the other Yidden, that he heard that a Yid was suffering for the crying and the screaming of another Yid. That's what really evoked the Rachamim that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to bring. And the Meshech Chochmah basically says the same thing. The pasuk says towards the beginning of the Seder, Vayitzavim el bnei Yisrael ve'el Paro melech Mitzrayim lahotzi as bnei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. And Pasuk says, Vayitzavim, and he commanded. Doesn't say what was commanded. Doesn't say what was commanded. So Rashi says that he was commanded on Tziva Osam al Shiluach Avodim. That we have a halacha that when someone has an eved, that there is a time that you have to send out. When a certain amount of years finishes, you have to send the eved free. You have to send him free.
And if he doesn't want to go, you have to put his ear to a post or something?
Yeah, but there are time limits for... There are time limits for the avodim. And the Mefarshim say that it's like unbelievable that at a time while they were enslaved and they were sweating and dripping from work, is that the time to tell them about when they're going to come into Eretz Yisrael and they're going to have avodim, that you have to set them free at a certain time? It was like the furthest thing from what you could imagine. It wasn't the right time. But the answer is, the Mefarshim say, because a human being is most vulnerable and receptive. They're receptive when they have the most empathy for the situation. Meaning, had they come to Eretz Yisrael and had avodim and then been told about freeing the avodim, fine, it's another halacha and something that they have to do. But while they were being beaten on and they were told that there's going to come a day that you're going to have avodim, and you have to be sensitive to the eved and let him go at a certain time, while he's being beaten on, he could appreciate the freedom of an eved, of a slave, more so while he's still a slave and being told about it than even later. But the Meshech Chochmah says a little bit of a different twist. What I began to say to you, that some of the Yidden had avodim because they simply, you take a group of Jews, if they're in a community, a year or two later, one or two are going to find a way to make a little more money than the other guy and whatever. So the Meshech Chochmah says that the reason that HaKadosh Baruch Hu now was beginning to really move on with taking out the Yidden is because, and that's what they were told, that some of you have avodim. Let go of your avodim, and then you are going to be let go of as avodim. In other words, we have to sensitize ourselves to someone else's sorrows. And that really, in a long way, relieves us from the pain and the grief that we are suffering. Another person would say, look, I have enough problems of my own. I am to this, I'm to that, I can't. But when a person pushes himself aside, despite, and everyone has a ton of pressure on their shoulders, for this, for that, what they need to do, what they have to do, and they work their way out of the umbrella, being under the umbrella of being the victim, so to speak. Oh, I'm overwhelmed, I can't handle it, I can't. And they worry about someone else. That is the relief process for they themselves. So says the Meshech Chochmah. Now, the Sfas Emes says, that at the end of last Sedra, Moshe Rabbeinu, he went to Paro, and at the end of last Sedra, things got worse for the Yidden. He said, I'm not going to give them any more straw, and the amount of production. I want to remain the same. Don't say that you don't have enough straw. It became much worse. And Moshe Rabbeinu, towards the tail end of last week's Sedra, said, Umeyaz. And from then, Basi al Par, from the time that I started going to Par, Heira la'om hazeh, that it got worse for the Jews. They're complaining, and the Jews told off Moshe and Aaron and said, what did you do? You gave Paro a sword to kill us? In other words, we have to go and produce the same amount of bricks without having any material? How can we survive this? That was the end of last week's Sedra. And the Sfas Emes says that Heira, which means you made it, Moshe Rabbeinu said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it got worse. It got bad for the Yidden. And he says a very interesting thought. We know that any suffering that a Yid has in Olam Hazeh, it takes off either for later in his life from suffering. There are some people, they turn 86, and it shouldn't happen to any of us. We should live to 120. They don't wake up in the morning. They didn't have to go to the hospital, and they didn't have to suffer for 10 years, and they didn't lose their hearing, and they didn't lose their eyesight, and they didn't look. And there's others that they die after 10 years of suffering. So the Sfas Emes says that the Medrash points out that the mistake that Moshe Rabbeinu made, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu begins our Sedra and says, with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they never talked like that it got bad for them to use a word like that. Bad? Is there something in life that's bad? We have to realize that if something seems to be bad, it's only the relief for the future. And that's why he says, there's a famous question asked, that when Yosef saw Binyamin, so if you look at Rashi, he quotes the Medrash, that Yosef cried because he saw that there would be the destruction of the Bais Hamikdash in the Chelik of Binyamin. So he cried. So they asked, why did he cry then? There was no Bais Hamikdash yet, because he saw, so says the Sfas Emes, that the suffering of the Jews in Mitzrayim, even the brothers when they came down and he was torturing them, oh no, you're spies, you're not coming for food, that had he continued the torturing of the brothers, it says, V'lo yachol Yosef lehisapek, he couldn't hold out anymore, so he had to reveal himself. But says the Sfas Emes, and he quotes a Medrash, that if he would have held out and continued to torture them, then there would never have been a destruction of either Bais Hamikdash.
Wow.
Because their suffering then would have exempted them later from the suffering that they had to go through. So the point is that when he was crying, and he was crying not about the fact that, he finally saw his brother and he meant so much, it was all emotion. He was crying about the Bais Hamikdash because he saw that it would end up being destroyed because he couldn't hold back from revealing himself and take it further of how the brothers were suffering. So says the Sfas Emes that when there is a desire to endure, that means we don't have to bring tsaros on us. Rebbes used to do that. They used to have Gilgul Shelag. Many tzaddikim used to go out into the snow, and they used to roll in the snow to bring suffering to them, that it freed up an entire population. We know there was a Yid that lived 350 years ago, and his name was Rav Shimshon Istropola. And they showed him, it was at the time of Tach V'Tat. There was a time that they were murdering Yidden left and right. It was around 350 years ago. It was the Hebrew year of 48-49 in the 5,000 cycle. So it's like 350, 370 years ago. And they showed Reb Shimshon Istropola Bachalom that there was going to be another million, like tens of thousands of Yidden murdered, unless he would agree to be tortured and killed in this pogrom. Because if he didn't want to be tortured, they could never touch him. Just like with Sarah Haruge Malchus, that when they were told that they're going to be killed, they answered and said, give us 3 days, we'll answer you if we're going to allow it. Because the level of tzaddikim, I even heard from tzaddikim, big tzaddikim, who were nifter 50 years ago, 60 years, when I was younger, say that if we didn't want to die, the Malach HaMavis, when he comes to us, we could destroy him and make him into a pile of ashes. And he could not take our neshamas. And the only reason that we allow it is because of the fact that we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to leave the world. It's the Ratzon of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we allow it to happen. And that's really what the Asar Aruge Malchus answered and said, that if we're not maskim, we'll come down and let you know if you're going to torture us or kill us, because if we say no, it's not happening. And the same thing happened with Rav Shimshon Istropola, and he said, of course, I would rather be tortured and killed. And he was tortured and killed. But they showed him, Min HaShamayim, that his death and suffering was going to accept the 600,000 or 900,000 Yidden that were about to be tortured and killed. He was the one, as a matter of fact, speaking of, all the Mekubolim of the world wrote to him to explain to them what the Arizal said in regard to the 10 plagues, the Eser Makos, that happened in Mitzrayim. The Arizal wrote a paragraph al pi Kabbalah in code, and the Mekubalim who were steeped into Kabbalah, but they couldn't understand that paragraph. And they asked Rav Shimshon Istropola, the one that we're just speaking about, to explain it to them. And he said he didn't want to do it. It was too much of a secret. And if they understood it, they understood it. But if they didn't understand it, so they didn't, and told they themselves will achieve the level to understand it, that's when they'll understand. But they kept pestering him, and one of his closest friends, a very big Makubal, wrote him and begged him, tell us what this means. And he did. And as a matter of fact, in many Haggadahs and many in Klal Yisrael say his explanation Erev Pesach. And he writes that somebody who says this, it's like a page and a half, not that, it's long, but it's not that long, it's not 10 pages. Anyone who says this Erev Pesach should know that year he's going to be spared from a lot of terrible gezeras. Maybe he'll get sick and end up in a hospital 6 months. He will be spared if Erev Pesach, he says, the statement of the Arizal, And then he explains it in simplest detail that you didn't have to be a genius or a makubal to understand. And it's in most Haggadahs. They have it at the beginning of the Haggadah because he goes in, it was a statement of the Arizal about our Sedra, detailing the Eser Makos, and what it was. You know that there was a stick, the staff of Moshe Rabbeinu, and on the stick it said, Datzach Adash Biachav. Anyone ever hear that before?
No. Yeah, that's nothing. Sorry.
So there were great secrets, and when you read what he wrote, how he explained what the Arizal was writing, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And people who have said it every year for 50 years, they come after reading and said, I still can't get over in other words, only a malach from heaven could have understood what the Arizal was saying. And Reb Shimshon Nistropola was a malach. In other words, he was the biggest of the big and unbelievable. So he says it. Derech Agav, I do want to say to you that in this week's Sedra, there are 7 of the 10 plagues. Next week in Bo, there are 3. And the Mekubalim explain, and some of the regular Hasidic Svarim, that we know that the 10 spheres of the world with which HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, the first 3 is Chochmah, Bina, and Das. And then it goes into Chesed and Gevurah and Tiferes, the different midos that there are. So they say, and they explain in detail how each one, like the first one, Dam, blood, corresponds to Chesed. It's the 3 of next week that's Chochmah, Bina, and Das. And the first 7, Dam, Tzevardeya, Kinim, Aro, each correspond to a different midah, to the Chesed, the Gevurah, and why it fits in, and how the manifestation of that specific plague ended up happening because it corresponded to that actual midah and what the essence of that midah is. Now, I want to say to you that the Balaturim, and remember that the Balaturim was the son of the Rosh, he lived around 950 years ago, and the Rosh is at the end of every Gemara. Every Yeshiva Bacher knows about the Rosh. And he had a son that wrote the Torah Shulchan Aruch. The Torah Shulchan Aruch. And in the Chumash, when we quote the Baal HaTurim, it's that same son of the Rosh. That's the Torah Shulchan Aruch. That's the one who is saying what is being said. And the Baal HaTurim says, and he quite often tells you, if there's a word that is different, that is customarily used, he points it out. So he says in this Sedra that the word by the frogs, Vahal Hatzvardeya, that the frogs went up. No, thank you, please. I appreciate it. Thank you. No. That Vahalat Svardeya, that the frogs went in, that the word Vahal is only found 2 times in all of Chamish and Chumshei Torah or Tanakh. Where are the 2 places? Over here with the frogs, Vahal, and Vahal, Aaron. Aaron went up the mountain and he died there. So he always tries to, not always, sometimes he'll just tell you that this is 2 words and that's it. But over here, like in many cases, he'll tell you what the connection of the two, that it's those 2 specific places that are used and not anywhere else. So he says that, the Gemara in Psachim says that Mishael, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that they learned a Kal V'chomer. And because Tosfos says over there in Psachim that they didn't have to really throw themselves into fire, because it wasn't real Avodah Zarah. It was some midget form that represented Nebuchadnezzar, but Tosfos explains why it was not pure Avodah Zarah. Now, if it's not pure Avodah Zarah, you don't have to kill yourself. In other words, there's 3 averos that a person has to give up his life. But if it's not Avodah Zarah, then you don't have to give up your life. So why did they jump into the fire? So Tosfos answers that they learned from the Tzvardeya, and the Gemara says it, and it talks a lot about this Kal V'chomer. They said that if the frogs gave up their lives for Kiddush Shem Shemayim, so we certainly have to do so and throw ourselves in. And it's on that Tosfos says that, but it wasn't Avodah Zarah, so why did they have to do it? So he answers, because somebody had to step up to the plate and make a public proclamation for the Kiddush Hashem, for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's why they did it. The Tzvardeya, it says, went into the refrigerators and into the beds and into everything. But there were Tzvardeya that chose to go into the ovens. And the ovens meant that a burning oven, that they were giving up their lives. And at the end of the story, everything died. All the Tzvardeya died, except for the ones that came out of the oven. They stayed alive. They were given life because they were ready to give up their life for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah learned up that if the Tzvardeya did what they did, we certainly have to do it. And that's why they jumped into the fire. But the Meforshim explain, not because of Avodah Zarah, but because there's a time that you have to step up to the plate. And you have to be able to exemplify Kiddush Shem Shemayim. Yes?
Yeah, the Lelva Rabbi Yehoshua says something very cute about this. Those frogs that went into the oven were spared, but only them, only that year, only them. But the dogs that were quiet by Yitzias Mitzrayim, that's every generation of dogs get rewarded for this. So how come that was a bigger payment? So this is only the level of the Rebbe could say anything like this. Okay, Mesiras Nefesh, a Yid is really like this inside Mesiras Nefesh. But to keep your mouth closed, that is really something.
Yeah, there's a different question that's asked. The Chamoirim, the donkeys, carried for the Yidden when they left the time. Each Yid had, according to the common medrash, 90 donkeys laden with gold, silver, and everything. They emptied out. It says they emptied out Mitzrayim, and then Bizas Hayam, on the Yam, they got more. So the Chamoirim were given a halacha of Kedushas Bechor. In other words, we have such a law as a Bechor. Before a boy, let's say when he's born, 30 days later you make a Pidyon Haben. That's to redeem him. Let's say someone doesn't have a Pidyon Haben and he's a firstborn. You are never allowed to even ask him to pour you a cup of soda. Why? Because he still has Kedushas Bechor. He had no Pidyon. He was never redeemed. And if you don't have a pidyon, then and you were never redeemed, you remain kadosh. So you can't. So therefore, we have to have a pidyon haben. Now, an animal also, there's such a thing as kedushas bechor. But and only kosher animals. One exception is the chamor. The chamor, the donkey. So the question is asked, and really it's for next week, because that's when it says lo yechratz kelev l'shona, next week. But since it was mentioned about the dogs, I'm just telling it to you, a thought that's said by the Chazal, by Kadmonim, that dogs, because they didn't bark, and it's the teva of a dog, when there's a behala, and there's a lot of screaming and yell, and that's what was going on in Mitzrayim, then they always chime in and they bark along. But what actually happened, even though they should have barked, and that was a common thing, they kept quiet. So what do? We throw to them any of the treif meat, the nevela, treifa, we throw it to them, that instead of just putting it in the garbage, they got that as a reward. So asks the Sfas Emes, why didn't they get Kedushas Bechor also, just like the Chamorim? So he answers and says, because as mishlept for a yid, vert min HaKadosh. If you schlep, they had on the Chamorim had all the gold and silver. That makes you a Kadosh. The fact they kept quiet, they got reward, it was beautiful, it was unbelievable, but it wasn't equal. And that's why the only treif animal that is given Kedushas Bechor is a Chamor. So he says. But coming back to our Bal HaTurim, that the fact is that they wanted to be Makadesh Shem Shemaim. You see, a statement had to be made. Everyone was bowing down to Nebuchadnezzar's midget. The Gemara calls it a midget. That little thing. And no one was making a statement. So the frog stood up at the time when they went into the tanur, when they went into the ovens. And Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah also made a statement. And they felt that, Al Pidim, we don't have to really do this, but we're doing it because somebody has to step up to the plate and make a proclamation. See, the problem with stepping up to the plate is to this day. Many times a group will come together and say, we must do this. There's no mikveh in our community. We've got to build a mikveh. There's no second Sefer Torah in our shul, and there's certain Shabbosos you need a second Sefer, you need even a third Sefer. We don't have it. And it's always for somebody else to do it. They themselves, they participate in the conversation, in the discussion. They agree to what the need is, but it's for someone else to do it. It's not myself. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah said, someone else, everyone should be doing it. But we're not passing the buck. We're going to do it to make the proclamation for our Kodesh Baruch Hu. So that says the Meforshim on the Balaturim, why it says Vaha'al by these tzvardim, by these frogs, when they threw themselves into the Tanur, and the word Vahal by Aaron, because Yan Lahakti Sheni, that there was a criticism to both Moshe Rabbeinu and to Aaron. And that's why Aaron died at that point, because he did not facilitate. Now, if you remember the story of hitting of the rock, and by the way, the Rambam says that it was not the fact that he hit the rock that he could not go into Eretz Yisrael. It was the fact that he said Shimu no hamoirim. He was speaking to the others and referring to the flock, to Klal Yisrael, moirim, the rebellion. You rebellious, listen to what I'm going to say. That the Rambam says is the reason that he couldn't go into Eretz Yisrael. And because he wasn't Mekadesh Shem Shemayim by not hitting the rock. But they bring a tremendous riot to the Rambam because on Shmini Atzeres, when we ask for Geshem, for rain, there are stanzas. And one is for Avram, one about water, and then Yitzchak, and then Yaakov, and then Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, for Moshe Rabbeinu, we say, Al Hasela Hoch Vayetzu Moyim, that he hit the rock and water came out. We say that on Shmini Atzeres. If that was a criticism and something that Moshe Rabbeinu lost the privilege of going into Eretz Yisrael because he hit the rock, says the Rambam, then why would we say it on Shmini Atzeres? Why would we ask in our supplication for rain, why would we be proud of that story and mention it? Please give us rain, because don't forget Moshe Rabbeinu hit the rock and water came out. Hit the rock, that was a criticism. He couldn't go into Eretz Yisrael. So therefore the Rambam says that it was not because of that, it was because of the fact that he was very critical of Klal Yisrael and called them Moirim, Shimu no HaMoirim. Listen, all of you rebellious group, listen to what I'm saying to you. But the fact that the frogs stepped up to the plate and they didn't leave it, because they could have gone also, they weren't told where to go. The frogs jumped wherever they wanted to jump. They could have jumped into the cold refrigerator or somewhere else, to the drawers or the closets, where many of them did go. But the ones that went into the Tanur because they wanted to express and make a statement for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they were able to do so and merited to live after the story with the frogs was over, even though all the other frogs died. Now, the Pasuk says, when we lane Monday and Thursday and Shabbos afternoon, we lane Tol Sheni, and we give a Kohen, a Levi, and a Yisrael that reading, Torah reading, Monday morning, Thursday morning. Now the Levi's last pasuk is, V'lo shamu el Moshe, they did not listen to Moshe Rabbeinu, Klal Yisrael, mikotzer ruach, because of the shortness. They had no patience to listen to umei avoda kosher, from the hard work. They couldn't stand there listening to him, you're going to be taken out and we're going out. They couldn't accept it at that point. So we have a rule that it says in Shulchan Aruch, al tamod b'dover ra. That means a balkoira is never allowed to end a pasuk with something that's bad. So if, let's say, he has to make hosafas, they need to give a few extra aliyahs on Shabbos. Yom Tiv, you're not allowed to make any hosafas. It's 5 aliyahs and that's it. But on Shabbos, if let's say there's 100 psukim in the Sedra and we give out 7 aliyahs plus maftir, if you want to give an extra 2 or 4 or 6 aliyahs, you have to stop every 3 psukim. But if the pasuk ends with something negative, we don't stop there. We'll go a 4th pasuk, a 5th pasuk, anything that it should just be parav or good, but not bad. So the question that the Meforshim ask, why is it for the Levi who goes up to the 2nd aliyah in this week's Parsha on Monday and Thursday, it ends up mikoitzer ruach u'me'avoda kosher. That's what they ask. So the Vilna Gaon says that it's not bad news, it's good news. Because of that mikoitze ruach u'me'avoda kosha, that they were overworked. They went out 190 years earlier, and the Vilna Gaon says that on the pasuk vayimaru es chayayim, they embittered their lives ba'avoda kosha. He says that vayimaru es chayayim, the cantillation, the notes, the trop on the words is a kadma vi'azla. And the word kadma vi'azla means kadma, they preempted, they went out early, va'azla, and went. So says the Vilna Gaon that it's a remez that ba'avoda kosha caused them, so it was good news, because me'avoda kosha. Me'avoda kosha was an excellent thing that happened, they saved. And he even says that the gematria of Vayimaru es chayayim is 190. Because they went out 100, they were supposed to be there 400 years, and they were only there 210. And it was 190 years shorter. Because of Vayimaru es chayayim, that it turned out, and it's really a very big lesson to all of us. It's easier said than done. That means when a person has to take a lo aleinu lo aleichem, an operation, and it's painful, and after the operation, he's moaning, he's groaning, it's so painful, and he needs painkillers. But the operation was successful. It's going to help him for future life, years and years. So yes, there was some pain, but it was like an investment for the future. So the point being that the Vayimaru es chayayim, we have to realize that in life there's no such thing as a free ticket. I mean, I used to always hear that the people who were poor said, if only I had the money, there would be no problem. And there were just enough money and wonderful. You need nachas from the children, you need good health. What do you mean? Someone has 10 million that he has a guarantee on good health? There's plenty of people in the hospital who are fabulously wealthy. But the poor guy that's struggling to pay his gas bill, he's so into the problem that he doesn't have the money, that if he only had the... So we have to realize that when we come across situations which seem to us desperate or devastation, that we have to try our best, because it's easier said than done, that when a person is suffering, to rise above it and realize that it's going to help them with this, it's going to help them with that. You know, before the Geula, before Mashiach comes, there's 4,000 years of suffering. I mean, just look at the history of the Jewish people. We made do with very little, under the worst of circumstances, underground, in the forest, wherever we were. And Yidden always tried, I mean, you were the Holocaust, they were in the concentration camp, and they were gathering some of the oil so they should have, for 6 months later, Hanukkah, that they could light a candle for Hanukkah. And they didn't give up and say, well, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu put us in such a situation for the mitzvahs, we'll wait. There were people that were moiser nefesh, and that they really, under the worst of circumstances, were able to bring out the best in their ruchnias and make the difference. Like the story of the person who somebody just told me about their great-grandfather, that he came back to the barracks and he had a piece of bread, and they had like just rationing. They were dying there were people that were dropping from hunger. And he took the piece of bread and he saw a yid on the bed that he was sure was not going to live through the night. And as hungry as he was, and he wanted the piece of bread, he took it and gave it to the other. That's Umi Ka'amcha Yisrael. And the story is told, that it was told over to his whole family, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grand, that as soon as he gave the piece of bread and accepted he was going to sleep hungry and whatever, that somebody came in who was a Jew, but he was unfortunately not doing the right thing and causing pain and grief to other Jews. He came in with a bag of sugar cubes. And he liked this guy, the guy that had just before, he didn't see that he gave his piece of bread to the other guy. And he said, I'm able to get as much as I want. Here's the bag of sugar cubes. And this man's great-grandfather said that he lived for weeks because of that sugar. And this was right after he had given up his piece of bread. So when we give, we're really taking for ourselves, because no good deed, there's a saying, no good deed goes unpunished. But I'm saying the opposite, that no good deed, the Rebbeinu Shalom remains a balchoiv, remains indebted to the person, and that he will definitely bring out in opportunities when he has to really, he's desperate, he's able to get it. So our giving and helping others is something that could be exemplified. And I always quote, I don't know if I've said it ever in this year, but the Gemara says that a whole list of people that they do not have a chelik in olam haba. And then the Gemara says, before it first says those who do have, yesh lahem chelik v'olam haba. And then the Mishnah lists those who don't have. So the Gemara and the Medrash ask, where is Micha? There was a guy that left Mitzrayim, and he was carrying with him an avodah zarah, and he served the avodah zarah, and that's why when they were put into the Golem, that there were 3 shvatim to the right, to the Oren, thank you, to the Oren, and there were 3 to the east, and the west, and the south. In the south, the one was done because Micha was from Shevet Dan, and they were put in the back. And half the time the Anani Yaakov didn't cover over them. They suffered. And the Anani Yaakov, the clouds, protected them from wild animals and from other things. But it didn't protect all of them because of this Avodah Zarah. And he went through the whole Midbar 40 years with this Avodah Zarah. And he went into Eretz Yisrael with Klal Yisrael with it. And every day he used to set up the Avodah Zarah and light the Ketores to the Avodah Zarah, the incense. And he used to put it near the real Ketores so that when the cloud of smoke went up, it intertwined with the other one. So when the smoke came into Shemayim, it says that it stunk so bad because it wasn't incense that was reach nichoyach, a good smelling. It was disgusting because it was coming in together with the avodah zarah. So the question, and immediately the first day he did this, it says that all the Malachi Hashari stood up to go down and kill him. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu stepped in and said, you cannot touch him. And this went on for years and years. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't have the Reach Nichoyach from the Ketores. Why didn't he let him touch him? Because he used to all day do one thing: feed the poor. Somebody who feeds Yidden, you can't touch him, even though he's doing Avodah Zarah. Now, Avodah Zarah can really the worst Avera, because any Avera that a person plans to do, the Machshava, he wants to do it, but he doesn't end up doing it, he doesn't get any negative record. In other words, you could have planned, you were in your car and you wanted to take this gun and go shoot that guy, but you got 2 flat tires, so you couldn't get to the guy. But had you gotten to the guy, you would have shot him. But you didn't shoot him? Nothing on the record. But the one Aveira that a person who plans to do it and has the machshava to do it and ends up not doing it and is punished as if they did do the Aveira is Avodah Zarah. So this was what Micha was doing, the worst of the worst. It's worse than Gili Arroyos, it's worse than Shvichas Domim, because the others, Machshav is not Kemaisa, but by Avodah Zarah it is. So we see that when we put ourselves out for others, then it comes back thousandfold, not just Kiflayim, but Elef Pa'omim, as Moshe Rabbeinu said on the opening parsha of Devarim before he was Nifter. So I want to thank each and every one of you for coming, and we hope that you have a good week. And this parsha sows the seeds of Geula, as Reb Shimshon Estropola points out, that this wasn't suffering, this was good, this was no Heira. They left early, and for things that were going to happen 1,000 years later, they were pottered up because of this suffering for these 210 years. So we've suffered enough, and we've had longer enough golos, and we hope that the Rabbanu Shalom would be very kind to us, and he is kind to us each and every day, but there would be an extra dose, and that we would have the Geula Shlema.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much.
Rabbi Balkany, you said that the Yidden, some Yidden